We're gathered here, of course, today because Labor is experiencing some dark and troubled times. Specifically, federal Labor is negotiating one of the toughest and most demanding political environments that you could possibly imagine. It is, of course, not the first time Labor has negotiated such a political environment. The party, of course, has been forced to govern through recessions, Great Depressions. The party has been forced to govern during 2 world wars, on one occasion not particularly successfully. I heard mention of the Judean people earlier, and I think it'd be fair to say that the Labor Party has actually split more times than the United Judean People's Front. So, this is not a new story, the story that we're exploring today. On that term story, that's what basically I want to talk about in my short time today. I want to talk about the stories that the early Labor Party told about itself, told about the working people of this nation, and of course the nation that those working people did so much to literally build up. And the early Labourites told those stories, attempted to form governments in an extremely tough and demanding political era. They did so against much opposition from conservative enemies and, truth be told, ideologues to the party's left and, in some cases, within the party itself. In 2011, I would submit to you, that story is pretty much the same. And Labor's task is much the same, about building a more prosperous and egalitarian, and in modern parlance, more environmentally sustainable society. And whilst the environment clearly wasn't an issue in the period that I want to talk about today, Labourites busied themselves with much the same task. They never accepted the status quo, that widespread, massive material deprivation, massive rates of poverty and inequality were natural or permanent. They did not accept that Australian political culture was inherently conservative, or that achieving progressive social and political change was impossible. Instead, as I hope to show you briefly today, they worked hard, damn hard, to democratically and through constitutional means to change Australian political culture, to make progressive politics the common sense politics of most voters. So how did they fare? We should never forget, as Tim alluded to before, Labor was the world's most precocious social democratic party. It was the first party of its type to form a state or then colonial government in Queensland in 1899, or national government, whether minority under Chris Watson in 1904 or Andrew Fisher in 1910 in a majority status. And this was always something more than a crude vote-winning exercise, getting punters to tick the Labor box or put a 1 in the Labor box at the ballot box. Labor's achievements owed much to this cultural sea change that the party, its leaders, its rank and file, and key trade unions ushered in. They shifted the political culture of this nation to the left. And we shouldn't be afraid to use the term left. We are a party of the centre left, but never forget that we are a party of the left. And these pioneer Labourites were able to achieve that cultural sea change by constructing a good story. They had a terrific story to tell. It's what much of the commentariat calls a narrative these days. And this narrative insisted that Labor values, democracy, equality, solidarity, social justice, the common good, were not just Labor values, they were the values of the wider nation. And these early Labourites were prolific writers, prolific speakers, and they're almost evangelic proselytisers. As Jim McGowan, the long-time New South Wales state Labor leader and its first premier, boasted in April 1910, the movement was as dear to them as a religion, and everywhere their success had been due to this. McGowan made that point on the night that Andrew Fisher took majority government for Labor for the first time, and just a few months later, he led New South Wales Labor into office for the first time. And we should never forget how heroic this achievement was. There is a myth which does the rounds of Australian historians and political scientists and much of the Labor Party that working people sort of arrived gift-wrapped as a constituency for the Labor Party. This is wrong. Working people, lower middle-class people, the wider electorate, had to be won over. Coalitions needed to be formed, not just between classes, but within the working class itself and across very diverse industries, occupations and regions. And I'd just like to read you a terrific quote from a New South Wales MP. "It's votes that count," insisted W.J. Ferguson. This is in the late 1890s. "Two-thirds of Sydney workers are not prepared to go to the lengths of unionism, and socialism is a step beyond." And the importance of Labor connecting with these potential supporters, whether through union-backed Labor newspapers or the efforts of Labor politicians in Parliament or on the hustings, can never be underemphasised. It is particularly so when we consider the virulence, the absolute virulence of anti-Labor propaganda produced by its enemies. And I agree with a panellist from the last panel who said that it's not such a bad thing to have enemies. When it first emerged as a serious political player in the 1900s, federal Labor faced a barrage of criticism, much as it does today. Whereas Julia Gillard is these days amazingly likened by that liberal, intellectually depraved type Sophie Mirabella as akin to Muammar Gaddafi. Early Labor leaders such as Chris Watson, a relatively straight-laced, moderate man, were equated with wild socialists of Karl Marx's ilk. Take, for instance, one well-funded bosses magazine, Liberty and Progress, a misnomer if ever there was one. Commenting on Watson's world-first Labor government of 1904, it alleged that he was disingenuously presenting as a cautious leader. In reality, quote, "he was prepared to drag the country down with him to socialism and ruin. A government of self-confessed socialists should not have been tolerated in office 1 hour." Now, such nonsense, and it was utter nonsense, needed to be met head-on with equal doses of passion and reasoned argument. And so Watson thus returned fire, mocking the critics of Labor-style socialism. This is one of my favourite quotes. "The very people who objected to socialism were immersed in it. They rode in socialistic railways, sent their children to socialistic schools, received their letters through a socialistic post office, read them by a socialistic light, rang up their friends on a socialistic telephone, washed in socialistic baths, read in socialistic libraries, and if, through studying the advantages of individualism, they became insane, they retired to a socialistic asylum." Now, Watson's humorous takedown, I think, is still relevant. In my opinion, Watson's words should act as a tactical and strategic clarion call for us today. Replace socialism with environmentalism, and an opportunity arises for Labor to pursue a similar line as regards Tony Abbott's hyperbole and relentless negativity on climate change, and actually basically any issue under the sun. And perhaps too, the same logic must apply to the Greens on Labor's left. Although federal Labor is compelled to accept Greens' assistance during this Parliament, it ought to vigorously define itself against an ostensible ally, just as the early Laborites did in their day. Let me give one example. Most early Laborites thought of themselves as socialists, yet they were also canny enough to contrast their socialism with the ravings of the anti-Labor far left. For instance, in a 1909 debate against the Socialist Party, New South Wales Labor politician Arthur Griffith lashed Labor's critics to its left. Quote, "We are the sane and common sense socialists who believe in going step by step and who realise that you can never get to the top of the ladder unless you climb rung by rung. But the scattered groups of socialists seem to think that we have to do nothing for a long time, and then suddenly someone rings a bell and a new era will be ushered in, just like the falling of a drop scene in a theatre." And for Griffith, not only were these fellows hopeless dreamers, they were also disloyal abettors of Labor's Tory enemies. He went on, "I've never heard of an advanced guard turning around and firing upon the main body of an army. Labor is fighting against the concentrated power of wealth and capital and moneyed interests and a mighty press. And yet these men come around, and instead of helping us, they knife us in the back. Again, I put to you, replace socialist with environmentalist and a long-term strategy emerges. For it was no coincidence that a year after Griffith's intervention, Labor took office in its own right for the first time. And it was an extraordinary development. Just let me put it in comparative perspective. Whereas British Labor was little more than a parliamentary rump, and the great socialist parties, the famed socialist parties of France and Germany, were pathetically weak. The planks of Labor's platform were actually being made law at a federal and state level. No Labor Party existed in New Zealand, and no Labor Party of any substance ever existed in the United States. Fast forward 100 years, and Labor, of course, in its 120th year, is engaged in much soul-searching. There are those loudly proclaiming the death of Labor, as we know it, as working-class battlers foam at the mouth against middle-class progressives. There are others who proclaim that environmental politics now represents the most serious threat to the continuing existence of social democratic parties. And, it should be said, whereas communists here in Australia only ever managed to win one single seat, at the last New South Wales state election, the Greens polled close to half of Labor's primary vote and won their first lower house seat. Of course, the ALP is not alone in facing these problems. Most of the world's centre-left parties, as we've already heard, are struggling to define themselves in a post-Cold War world, one radically different to the world that the early Laborites encountered. And yet, I would argue that Labor today finds itself in much the same situation that it did 120 years ago. There is a reason why Labor has endured for well over a century, through 3 serious splits, 2 world wars, and countless crises. And it is no coincidence that a Labor woman recently became the nation's first Prime Minister. If there is any party capable of rising to the challenge of rebuilding progressive politics, history tells us that that party is Labor. Indeed, I would challenge Labor, I would challenge everyone in the audience today to instead, rather than seeing the current electoral outlook as an existential threat, we should instead perceive it as an opportunity to again dominate the reforming centre of this nation's politics. To dominate this nation's, the centre of this nation's politics, I think it is also incumbent on us to take a lesson from the early Laborites and seek to shift the political culture of this nation to the left. But Labor's narrative, the stories it tells, should be much the same. On its right are Tea Party-style conservatives who refuse to acknowledge the threat that climate change poses, much as their predecessors refused to acknowledge the gross inequality and gross poverty that came along with the rise of industrial capitalism. When a future historian sits down to write this period of our nation's history, I think the villains will be clear for all to see. On Labor's left, I think it's unclear whether the Greens wish to be heroes or villains. There are those Greens who, like Labor's early socialist critics, believed in smashing everything up in order to achieve their utopian fantasies, no matter the human cost. But there are others who sincerely desire to achieve progressive change via compromise. It remains to be seen which way they will jump. But in the meantime, Labor must hold them to account, just as it must hold its rivals to account on the right. Labor's history shows that this is possible. Just finish by thinking about applying the lessons of the past. Labor can indeed draw many lessons from its history, both good ones and bad ones, but I don't believe it should fetish that past. It shouldn't descend into nostalgia. Instead, Labor, us, we must believe that Labor's greatest achievements are yet to come. Thanks.